and welcome to In Focus South Asia. I'm Meher Sher, filling in for Ijaz Haider today. Complete shutdown is being observed in Indian-occupied Kashmir today against the recent killing of civilians and destruction of property by Indian forces. On Sunday, in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, Indian government forces shot at peaceful protesters in the Shopian district. They killed one and wounded dozens of innocent civilians. Indian troops also burned down houses and used pellet guns against people. As usual, internet services were also suspended in the area to prevent the spread of information regarding the incident. The protesters had gathered to demonstrate against the extrajudicial murder of a student, Jahangir Ahmed Wani, who was killed on March 14th. Wani was studying at Government Degree College in Kupwara. Kashmiris keep rising up against the Indian state in protest, more often than not at the cost of their lives. Some are shot on sight, while others are killed in fake encounters. This oppressive, horrific cycle seems never-ending. When will the world support the voices the Indian government routinely silences? With the internet shutdowns in place to keep the world ignorant of the Indian government's gross human rights violations, what is actually taking place on the ground in Kashmir? What does India plan to accomplish through ruling by force? Let's analyze the latest incidents in Indian-occupied Kashmir with our panel of experts. In this segment, we have with us Lieutenant General Amjad Shoaib. He's an analyst based in Islamabad. Lieutenant General Amjad Shoaib is a retired 3-star war veteran and a defense analyst. We also have with us former Ambassador Najmuddin Shaikh. Ambassador Najmuddin Shaikh is a former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan and served as High Commissioner to Canada, Ambassador to Germany, US and Iran, and he is joining us from Karachi. General Amjad Shoaib, I want to start the discussion with you. The Indian media reported that firing took place between terrorists and the Indian security forces in Shopian. They claim that a high-level commander of Jaish-e-Mohammed outfit was among 2 others killed in an operation conducted by the Indian forces. As we know, there is a new wave of an indigenous independence movement in occupied Kashmir since the killing of Burhan Wani. So how do you view the Indian version of these events, and do you see it as a complete distortion of reality on the ground?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. See, there are 2-3 points which one has to keep in mind. First of all, when they use the name Jaish-e-Mohammed, they will always point a finger towards Pakistan, which is wrong. See, there are certain brand names which have been assumed by the resistant groups in Kashmir, and they or any name. For example, when we use the word Daesh, Daesh is everywhere. So similarly, Jaish-e-Mohammed, anybody can use the name, so there is no linkage as far as Pakistan is concerned. India has been pointing out on a number of occasions that there are launch pads across the LOC, and we are taking care of that. But we have always told them that you can verify from any source, from any independent source can come and see, because there is no infiltration going on. But unfortunately, this is their trend. They want to show to the international community that Pakistan is the one who Pakistan is promoting insurgency in Kashmir. And that is how they are defaming the actual, genuine effort of the people of the Kashmir. Then there are extrajudicial killings. See, they get hold of the people and sometimes they just kill them and create a scene because they get reward for that. And this monetary reward has attracted the people towards this illegal action. And many people, I mean, you must have heard of the story where a captain along with another 2 people, they killed 3 young men who had nothing to do with the insurgency or nothing to do with this militancy there. But they were killed, and then they claimed the reward, etc. And ultimately, these are the people of the area who brought out the reality to the fore, and they got hold of the media and then told them. The local people, then they brought out the evidence. So these are the problems, unfortunately, they are suppressing. And then every time when they kill 2-3 people, along with that, they destroy a few houses, burn the houses, and the entire village has to suffer for a number of days for the atrocities which they let loose on those people. So unfortunately, this incident has also taken similar shape, and it's a regular pattern as far as the Indian repression in Kashmir is concerned. It's a regular pattern. They destroy the village, they punish the people, And unfortunately, those innocent people, they are suffering at the hands of the international and at the hands of the Indian army, and somehow it's not attracting the international attention.
Right. Ambassador Najmuddin, once again, Indian troops in Kashmir have shot at peaceful protesters in Indian-occupied Kashmir. We see the cycle repeating itself week by week, wherein Kashmiris resist India's oppressive rule and pay for their resistance with their lives. How do you see this latest violence in Kashmir in the larger picture?
Well, if you look at the incident, you look at what has happened in Shopia and Pulwama, both of them are completely shut down. The internet has been shut off. Gasoline and chemicals have been used to burn down houses. And the Indians have not succeeded in breaking the will of the Kashmiri people or the will to resist the illegal occupation of Jammu and Kashmir by India. For the Indians, it is frustrating to have to acknowledge that when they abrogated Article 370 and Article 35A, they maintained quite confidently that everything will become normal within 6 months. Those 6 months have stretched out to more than 18 months and will probably go on for much, much longer because the will of the Kashmiri people has not been broken. As regards the incidents that they have created, Mirwais Farooq was released, but then rearrested because they did not want him to preach a sermon, the Friday sermon, which was traditional. These are things that they've done, and these are a reflection of their frustration with what they've been able to achieve. Now, what are the facts on the ground? You talked about the fact, and General Shoaib talked about the fact that they hold Jaish-e-Mohammed or other organizations responsible. There's one credible source that can be used. It's the New York Times reporter in New Delhi, Gettleman, who reported not too long ago that the uprising in Kashmir is entirely indigenous, that at last count, and this was, I think, about 6 months ago, he said the maximum that you could think of is 8 people were from across the line of control, but that the movement is entirely Hizb Mujahideen. And the Hizb Mujahideen is entirely Kashmiri party, which is resisting the Indian occupation of Jammu and Kashmir.
Right, sir, it's indigenous.
It is indigenous, and that is what is most bothersome for them. Now, what have they done? That is somewhat more ominous. Today, I think in the Indian Parliament, in answering questions, the Indians have said that almost 3.4 million domicile certificates have been issued. That means that 3.4 million Indians have been converted into residents of Kashmir. This is known as the Indianization of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Equally ominously, they have had about a dozen IAS officers, Indian Administrative Service officers, posted to Indian-occupied Kashmir, and they have plans to add another 2 dozen IAS officials to this number, which means 2 things. One, that the administrative control will lie very largely with these the senior posts in Kashmir will be occupied not by Kashmiris but by Indians who have been imported for this particular purpose, and that their decisions will not necessarily reflect the intimate knowledge of the region that should be necessary in order to provide proper administrative control. The second facet of this is that those 3.3 million domiciles that they have issued means that now the Indianization of Kashmir is proceeding, and this will be assisted by the fact that there are Indian Administrative Service officers who are in the key positions in Kashmir.
Right, sir. Bringing General Amjad Shoaib back into the discussion as well, to expand on the point that Ambassador Najmuddin made, which is that 3.4 million Indian citizens have been issued domicile certificates. So General Amjad Shoaib, Kashmiris say that the one right they were able to maintain since 1954 was the ownership of their land under Article 35A. Now that, of course, is no longer the case since the scrapping of Kashmir's special status. So Indian citizens can now acquire property and settle there, as Ambassador Najmuddin just discussed. As a result, how much of a demographic shift or transformation do you think will take place in the region in the coming years since the special status has been scrapped?
See, I think for the last about 10 years, India has been pursuing this policy. And previously, in the garb of refugees from Kashmir, they have been bringing in certain people, and they were settling them in Jammu area, where the Hindu population was there to welcome, and primarily Hindus were settled there. But then we had Modi there. Modi decided to change the entire demographic structure of the valley, and we have about 80 to 90 lakhs of Muslim people living there. And that is where perhaps the Indians feel that there is a requirement to change the demographic proportion, so that once this ratio is changed, even the international community, if they say, okay, there is a pressure to hold a plebiscite in Kashmir, then they have no fear, because the population which they have brought into Kashmir from outside, particularly the Hindu population, they automatically will side with India. So that is how, in their own home, once the Kashmiri population is converted into minority, the Muslim population, they are converted into minority, India's purpose is served. So that is how they are working. This is the goal that they want to achieve. But unfortunately, we have not been able to mobilize international support for this violation of resolutions of Security Council. There's a very clear violation, and perhaps we could have created a lot of hue and cry, but unfortunately, we have not really moved in that direction where perhaps we could have mobilized the international support. At least we should have communicated to the P5 that at least make sure that the resolutions are respected. At least the Indians are forced to follow the resolutions. They should not be allowed to change the population. But then I think it is the Israeli model which they are facing. And if the people, they react to this situation, maybe they are ousted from their houses and they are told to camp along the LOC, where they become refugees in their own land. So this is the pattern which is emerging, and there will be a requirement for us to prepare for it and to forestall this design. If we can, we should preempt. If we keep on waiting, then ultimately, I think in few years' time, this entire population proportion will be changed, and we'll have the Muslim minority and Hindu majority in Kashmir.
Right, which would be a complete demographic shift. To further build on this, Ambassador Najmuddin, in your view, how fair or accurate is it to draw a comparison between what has happened in Palestine to what is currently taking place in Indian-occupied Kashmir?
Well, yes, we've always spoken in those terms about the ouster of the Palestinians from their land and what is now taking place in Kashmir being very similar. But again, I think you run up against the fact that while Biden has now made statements with regard to the fact that the solution in Palestine or in Israeli-occupied areas is that there be a two-state solution and that both states be viable, that there be an independent Palestinian state. That is a statement of intent. How far he's going to be able to implement it relies in the future. And unfortunately, I do not think that they will take the same attitude in Kashmir. It's unfortunate, but that is the reality, and it is a reality that flows from what they perceive India to be as the bulwark against China and as the counterbalancing force with regard to this. I think that in Kashmir, this is a question of particular importance and will, I think, provide new grounds for the resentment that Kashmiris have with regard to the Indian occupation. But how much this will affect the international community's perception and how much it will influence their, more importantly, how much it will influence their policies, I'm afraid I am not very optimistic on that regard.
Right. Thank you so much, Ambassador Najmuddin, Shaikh. Now coming back to you, General Amjad, it is clear to the world that the Kashmiris don't want to be a part of or don't want to be governed by India. And almost half of India's active military is currently in Kashmir. What does India think it will achieve through ruling by force? I mean, is it even sustainable to rule over 13 million people by force?
Gigi, I think it's a folly that they are thinking that this is the way that they can ultimately get rid of or satisfy the Kashmiri population. This will not happen. It has not happened for the last about 73 years. Even before that, right from 1931, Kashmiri people were fighting against the Dogra Raj. And after 47, they have been looking for their unification with Pakistan. So obviously, if the coming generations have not been able to really get rid of this desire of having unity with Pakistan, so this is the lesson which one has to learn, that even the coming generations won't do that. And this perhaps problem will continue. And if, God forbid, there is a massacre within the valley and they try to suppress the whole let's say, movement for independence or movement for joining Pakistan with the use of force, that will be a very big tragedy. And our Prime Minister had pointed out this thing during his address to the United Nations. This is the concern, I think, which we should keep on expressing to the international community, because the proportion, the way they have deployed their army there, it is very offensive, very aggressive posture. You have too many forces within the very, I should say, to take care of the small population. You have about 1 million or a little over 10 million people, million army, looking after the law and order situation. And obviously there you have one soldier to about 6-7 civilians. So this is a very serious situation. It is a highly militarized area. And there can be a situation where we have to face a very serious tragedy there. So I think this is the right time when we have to work very hard to draw the attention of the international community towards a problem which is brewing and which may ultimately take the shape of a reality. So this is very serious. And I think we have to work hard to make sure that the international community, I mean, we keep talking about American attitude, we keep talking about their requirement to pamper India against China, etc., but that doesn't mean that we should not work hard. I think
sir. Let's bring our next guest into the discussion. That's a very valid point you have made there. We now also have joining us Major General Ijaz Awan. He's an analyst, a former ambassador and army veteran, and he's joining us from Islamabad. Major General Ijaz Awan, you heard what General Amjad Shoaib said. So my question to you is that the Indian government has admitted that at any given time there aren't more than 200 to 300 people in Indian occupied Kashmir who have taken up arms or are considered militants by the government. Is it not obvious to the international community by those disproportionate figures that the excessive over 700,000 Indian troops are there to occupy Kashmir, not to fight 200 to 300 small-scale militants, if there are any?
Well, thank you very much. I fully agree with General Amjad Shoaib, and this Indian claim is self-defeating, self-contradicting. When they are saying there are only about 300 to 400 people who are armed and who are resisting the constitutional change or the taking away or stripping away of the status of Kashmir. If there are only 400 people resisting, then very validly your question that you're asking, why 700,000 armed military men are there, why there is a clampdown, why there is complete curfew-like situation, why the access to the international media and local media is being denied, why international observers are being denied to go and observe there, because 300 to 400 people, they do not bring a sea change in the entire area. Now, this is a self-contradicting, a baseless argument that the Indian government is forwarding. As a matter of fact, there is a complete popular resistance. The people of Kashmir, they are completely alienated, and there is no Kashmiri leadership, which previously used to be divided. Abdullahs and Muftis always sided with the Unionists, whereas the others were for the right of plebiscite and for their right as given by the United Nations. But now all of them are alienated and looking in one direction. They want their status to be restored, status of a state which is disputed, which needs to be resolved in the light of UN resolutions, and it is not an integral part of India. This is the common position with every Kashmiri, and this is what Pakistan wants, that it should happen, because there are three stakeholders, India, Pakistan, and the people of Kashmir.
Right.
And the decision is to be taken in the light of a plebiscite when it is held as per the UN resolution. So
right,
this
sir.
claim of
Sir, if I
India
may
is
interject.
absolutely baseless.
Right, sir. If I may this brings me actually to my next question I wanted to ask you. Pakistan is a key stakeholder in Kashmir. We issue statements and highlight the issue in Pakistan and internationally, but there is a feeling that perhaps Pakistan isn't doing more on the diplomatic front. Don't you think there is a need for Pakistan to perhaps send delegations to different parts of the world to raise awareness to the international community? Wouldn't this be a more effective approach?
Well, diplomacy is something very different. Unfortunately, the situation is that if we think that we will inform the international community, and if we think we will inform the Western countries or the Western world or the permanent five, then we are slightly mistaken. I think their own sources of information are very credible. They know the reality on ground. The voice has been raised in the British Parliament, in the UN Security Council, in American Congress, in the Human Rights Commission of United Nations. All the reports that have come up, they are clearly indicating that atrocities are being perpetrated by the Indian troops against innocent people of Kashmir. But that does not absolve us from our responsibility of doing more. The point that was made by the Prime Minister of Pakistan in the United Nations when he spoke there was very well received, but it needed to be followed up in a practical policy, or it had to be carried forward as a state policy. Visit is one option, using different forums like OIC or the Gulf GCC or the United Nations or the Western Union, not Western Union, the European Union. So we have to approach all these institutions and the human rights violation organization operating all over the world, including Amnesty International, where their office has been shut in India and they've been asked to move out. So we need to do more in electronic, in print media, in diplomacy. But unfortunately, world is turning a deaf ear toward their cries, the cries of the people of Kashmir, for their own strategic interests in the region, which is a very unfortunate situation.
Right, sir. I definitely agree. I do think also that we need to do more. Now, coming back to you, General Amjad Shoaib, is there any way to convince the United Nations to take more concrete steps, more practical steps to hold India accountable for their actions in Indian-occupied Kashmir? Just briefly, sir.
United Nations primarily is Security Council, which is perhaps governing everything. So naturally, P5 are the ones who are calling shots, so we have to convince them at the same time. The other members, the remaining 10 members, they also need to be persuaded. But I think it's the need, there's a need to have a constant contact with these people, with these countries at various levels. And I think human rights is the main issue which can attract the attention of the international community. Similarly, the atrocities against the women is one issue which can attract the attention of the international community. And it will be better if within these countries the public is mobilized. I mean, you can see the performance of our expatriates and also the people from Kashmir who are living in UK and elsewhere in Europe. They are working very hard, but then they need to be patronized, they need to be organized, they need to be provided resources, and
right,
along with them, they should be guided. They should be provided with themes to work on. So once you have the popular support within those countries, the people can bring about pressure on their own governments from within, and that perhaps will be a more effective way to handle. At the same time, the government-to-government at various levels, that contact should also be maintained, and we should. I mean, Kashmiris, they always say that Pakistan is their voice, but to what extent we raise our voice in support of Kashmir, I mean, it is obvious we are not doing the way we should have been doing. Personally, I feel that there should have been a delegation. Our women should have been going abroad. They should have been mobilizing the support for the women in Kashmir. Similarly, certain think tanks should have been hired, and we should have had sponsored articles in various international media also. But then I think there is a need to work out a proper plan, a massive plan, I should say, a plan which is all encompassing, including the media, including the legal side of the whole issue, including the human rights issue. All these things should be addressed in a manner that it should look to be a campaign going on. So I think there is a need to have a dedicated. Similarly, why don't we have a pointsman for Kashmir? We have appointed Mr. Sadiq as pointman for Afghanistan. He's totally dedicated to that issue, but we don't have a pointman for Kashmir. That can also be done. So there are a number of things which should have been done earlier, but I think even if we do it now, that will be quite appropriate.
Right. Thank you, Lieutenant General Amjad Shoaib, former Ambassador Najmuddin Shaikh, and Major General Ijaz Awan for joining us in this segment. We'll be taking a short break, but when we return, we will be discussing the Burqa ban and the Prevention of Terrorism Act in Sri Lanka. Stay with us. Welcome back. Let's move on to our second and final topic of the day. Sri Lanka has raised eyebrows over its burqa ban and the shutting of 1,000 Islamic schools in its latest bid to protect its national security. The Sri Lankan state defends the ban and says it is cracking down on religious extremism. The Sri Lankan government is also detaining people who they say have extremist religious views. These new rules have been set up under the controversial Prevention of Terrorism Act, or the PTA. Local and international human rights groups have been pushing for the repealment of this act. Many in Sri Lanka and worldwide are criticizing the government's moves as racist, as infringing on the Muslim minority's religious freedoms, and for robbing Muslim women of their right to choose how they dress. Sri Lanka's Minister for Public Security, Sarath Weerasekaara, announced the new rules just weeks before the second anniversary of the 2019 Easter attacks, which killed 269 people. Sri Lankans see this bill as divisive and an attempt to assuage the Buddhist majority. The bill will need to be passed by the cabinet and parliament, where the government has 2/3 majority before it is enforceable. As a first reaction from the international community, it was Pakistan's High Commissioner in Colombo, Saad Khattak, who expressed his concerns over the ban. He said it would injure the feelings of Sri Lankan Muslims and Muslims globally. Freedom of religion is protected by the Constitution of Sri Lanka. Does this bill violate Sri Lanka's constitution? The Sri Lankan government has termed the new rules as steps towards de-radicalization. But is this attempt truly to de-radicalize a minority or to infringe on their rights at the expense of the radical views of another group? We will be taking up these issues with our next panel of guests. We have joining us Tayab from London. He is a legal expert and human rights activist, and his practice encompasses criminal and civil public law in both the UK and international jurisdictions. We also have joining us Shakir Nawas. He's also joining us from London. He is the General Secretary of the Council of Sri Lankan Muslims organizations in the UK called Cosmos UK. Tayab, I would like to start with you. Many have criticized this bill as infringing on the religious freedoms of the Muslim minority. Based on your understanding of Sri Lankan law, is this bill constitutional?
Well, look, in terms of international law, it's very clear that the banning of a burqa, a religious dress, which a particular proportion of women wear, is discrimination. It disproportionately targets the minority Muslim women who wear them, and it violates their religious freedom. So in terms of international law, what Sri Lanka is proposing is a violation of international law. In terms of local law, if the constitution of Sri Lanka, which it does, protects minorities and prohibits discrimination, then it also violates Sri Lankan domestic law as well.
Tayab, if I'm not wrong, the Lankan constitution also protects religious freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, it amounts to this. It amounts to the same thing. I mean, what appears to be happening with this new set of policies is a bit of confusion from the Sri Lankan ministry. I'm not clear from listening to what the Minister for Public Security said is whether this is a ban to protect national security or whether this is a ban because they've identified what they purport to be religious extremism, and the ban, therefore, they say is necessary because of one of those two separate and distinct things. Now, my view of this is that it's simply part of the systemic attack on the minority Muslim population in Sri Lanka, and it follows on from the disgraceful policy which we recently saw with the policy to cremate Muslims that had died of COVID in Sri Lanka, which was, again, another violation of religious freedom and minority rights, and actually the International Civil Convention for Political Freedom. So with regards to what's happening in Sri Lanka, I think the government's quite confused about what it's doing. But what isn't confusing is that this disproportionately attacks a minority population within the country and is wrong in international and domestic law.
Right. Coming to you now, how do you see the timing of this bill just weeks before the second anniversary of the Easter attacks? And also, more importantly, how is the Muslim community in Sri Lanka viewing these new rules?
In fact, as Tayab said, there are two aspects of this particular ban it's going to implement to enforce on Muslims are seen as a security concern in public places and curb the Islamic extremism. Now, as most of the viewers knows, that the Sri Lankan government, who came on a majority of Sinhalese votes, suggests that it is to curb and to keep their voters happy in order to find the violation. To see the provincial council elections, which are going to happen very soon. So in that context, the Muslims are, soon after the Gazette notification of allowing the burial, something this particular incident has put forward to the public, seen as a very not compromising, not viewing in a way that it will bring tension among the communities and to win the election. By the way, there is a UNHRC sessions going on next week to pass the resolution. So even for that, this particular ban is going to bring the Muslim countries in a way that are not going to support maybe the resolution, because the public security minister tried to ban the face cover, and today the cabinet spokesperson is stating government won't enforce this particular law without proper consultation. In fact, government is having two sort of views within their own cabinet on this matter. And there has been not very widely welcomed by the Muslim communities in Sri Lanka.
Tayab, coming back to you, the Sri Lankan government is detaining those who have what they claim as religious extremist views. There's room for a lot of ambiguity in that. How does the government determine who has religious extremist views? And also, how does a burqa factor into this? And finally, what are the legal loopholes?
Well, look, I mean, looking at this without looking at this and sort of micromanaging what the Sri Lankan government is trying to do, it's very clear. There's a couple of things that I need to say about this. as far as I can see, this whole agenda is designed to target minority Muslim people, including women from within that group. Now, there are a number of things that the Sri Lankan government have said for this reason for doing this. Now, let's just look at those one at a time. If it's to tackle the idea that this is an extremist this is an extremist action within a particular ideology, i.e. that it's not necessary for women to wear a burqa. And also, they're not clear about what they're talking about, whether it's the burqa, the hijab, the niqab, and whether it's just Islamic dress. But I mean, what they're trying to say is that it's to protect women because women that wear the burqa tend to be persecuted by their own families. But to ban the burqa in this context would be a ridiculous thing to do, because what ends up happening, if that was to be true, and I'm not accepting that is true in any event.
Right,
if that was
and
to be
it seems
true,
like an assumption.
Yeah, it would confine women to their homes if it was true. It would impede their access to public service, and it would continue to marginalize them. So even if that was a valid reason, it's counterproductive to the problem that's as you say, that's assumed. So I think that's also not thought through. But if it was to, for example, to tackle terrorism, then this would be even more ludicrous, because part of a terrorist act is for the person perpetrating it to be identified, so their cause is identified to create terror. There is no point in creating terrorism or a terrorist attack if the people that are conducting that are identified. And it's also ridiculous to think that a person that's committing, let's say, for example, a suicide bombing, wants to hide their identity after that's happened. And from looking at, a large part of my work is in relation to representing and advising with respect to counterterrorism legislation. And so we know from looking at terrorist attacks across the world that the burqa is not a fundamental part of terrorist operations. They don't need to cover themselves in a burqa to do that. Terror tactic, you can hide your identity by wearing a baseball hat, for example, or by not looking at a CCTV camera. And to carry a device into an area, you don't need a burqa. You can carry it in a rucksack, as has happened many times, or in a bag, or even just leave it in a parcel. So the kind of the remedy that this is trying to solve, the problem that this is trying to solve, this is just not a remedy. What this is doing, in fact, is fanning the flames of division. What's happening is the government is feeding its own nationalist population, the very small element which want this populist agenda to be government policy, and it's fanning those flames of division. It's not bringing people together. It's not bringing understanding together. It's doing the exact opposite and creating a bigger problem. And we've seen what happens in the world when these types of problems become government policy. It's a recipe for actual disaster. It's not a recipe to bring the communities together and to solve problems. So this is a really badly thought through policy by the Sri Lankan government.
Right, which brings me to my next question. Shakir, if you could expand on this. The Sri Lankan government has referred to the new rules as an effort towards de-radicalization, yet the bill is very targeted towards the Muslim minority and doesn't encompass radicalization on the whole. What is the scale of radicalization in Sri Lanka? And is the issue limited to the Muslim minority as the government seems to suggest in Sri Lanka?
One must look within the Muslim community, understand their own tradition and principles and values. I mean, it is important that jurisprudence of minorities in context of for how long the Muslims were living in Sri Lanka over 1,000 years with a peaceful harmony and coexistence was the value of Muslims in Sri Lanka. There was soon after the Easter attacks and after the completion of the war in 2009, the Muslims were targeting in many ways. This was happening not only from 2009 onwards, from attacking the Muslims, the mob attacks, the violations in various parts of Sri Lanka has brought to a level where Muslims were demonized and Muslims were not treated in the rights of their own. So this particular burial issue, the cremation issue, has brought up a lot of concerns to the Muslims throughout Sri Lanka and worldwide. Now, in terms of living and targeting Muslims in Sri Lanka, was happening for some times in terms of burning, burials, and so many other issues pertaining to Muslims in their own rights. So, in terms of what Muslims were doing is very, very important to understand. thousands of years, Muslims were living in a peaceful, coexistent way, which was not denied. And even during the war time, Muslims had the support to the majority government at that time. They were in part of with ensuring that they were in hands in hand with them in order to take out the radicalization. In terms of radicalization, these are just myth, because after the Easter attack, the particular concept of even said that particular Easter attack was now comes to life after the documentation, and there were commissions were revealing that these were done by externally enforced, and even within certain groups tried to achieve their objective of regime change or certain inefficiency, or due to mismanagement of this particular issue in order and put the blame on the Muslims. But Muslims are not only party on this particular problem, because Muslims were even supported and made ensure that the perpetrators were identified even before the Easter attack, and supported after that in order to take out this radicalization concept, especially the education system, the madrasa system. All these must be allowed for the Muslims for themselves to consultation with the consultation of the ulamas and the intellectuals and the leaders of those groups in order to do it, rather than enforcing certain things.
Right. Thank you, Shakir Nawaz, for joining us. Tayab, coming back to you, now that the government has allowed the detainment of those with extremist views, can this be misused to crack down on other minorities in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, this is a common theme that runs through populist ideas and government policy. When you target a single group because you create a monster within that group and you perpetuate that concept, what people often don't realize is that they're next in line for the same law, because once the law's created and you've given that power to the state to effectively create a definition of something and define it in its own way, and then use that definition to, like you say, detain people or enact criminal procedures against those individuals. People should be frightened of that, because just because it's happening to one group today doesn't mean it won't happen to another group tomorrow. Frankly, the position here is that this is a recipe that governments have used for a long time, which is to say to people, look, you need to give away your freedom, you need to give away your liberty, and in order to be secure. There is not a correlation between your liberty and the right to be secure in that way. It's the government's responsibility to maintain a proper balance between keeping people secure and maintaining their right to freedom. Don't think for 1 minute that if a government tells you that this is your enemy and then makes very bad law to arrest or detain or to interfere with that person or that group's liberty, that it won't happen to somebody else. Because once you allow a government to behave in that way, they will behave in that way. It's natural for a government to want to gain more power for itself in order to maintain its control and in order to maintain its power base within its governmental structure. And we see this happen across the globe, and we're seeing it happen in Sri Lanka now. And again, as I say to you, it's dangerous. The more liberty that you give away, the harder it is to pull it back again.
Right, and now we have joining us our next guest, Lukman Harees. He's a political commentator and activist, and he's joining us from Reading, UK. He is a member of the task force on Sri Lankan burial issue, which was formed by the Muslim Council of Britain. He is also joining us to expand on this discussion. Lukman, I want to ask you about the burial issue. Religious freedom, I would like to reiterate before that, is protected by the Sri Lankan constitution. However, it wasn't until recently that burials were permitted during the pandemic. Throughout the pandemic, the government enforced cremations on Muslims in Sri Lanka. There was no scientific basis for that. What was the purpose of that?
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. What I need to do is to put the whole thing in context. If you look at the forced cremation policy, which ended only a few weeks ago, you need to put in the context of the wider, racist agenda of the Sri Lankan government. As we know that all over the world we had this coronavirus racism in a lot of parts in the world, but in Sri Lanka the speciality was that it was state sanctioned. It's a part of a wider racist agenda or the institutionalized racism since independence. Not only the Muslims, even the Tamil community, the biggest minority community in Sri Lanka, was affected as well, and that led to a 30-year-old war. So this forced cremation policy, if you put in the wider context of this racist agenda of the Sri Lankan government, it only increased, the tempo increased after this 2-year-old this Easter attack in 2019, and Muslims were demonized, and actually they were made part of the problem. They were said that these people were actually irresponsible, unpatriotic when they didn't accept the so-called, the medically sanctioned mandatory cremation policy. So what I'm trying to say here is, actually, if you look at the history, we had, of course, the constitutional guarantees were there. It's only on paper, and even the Supreme Court did not want to hear the case, and Muslims were, finally compelled to go before the international community to help them out. Eventually, it was the visit of the Imran Khan Prime Minister, as well as the pending, the forthcoming United Nations Human Rights Commission, the meeting in Geneva, which has actually tilted the scales, and where the Muslims were. Of course, it was part of a wider range, but two things I need to just tell you. Two things has to happen. One is the international pressure should be there. Number two is the compulsion. There should be better public activism in Sri Lanka.
Right. Now, Tayab, just a final question on this discussion. Many local and international human rights groups have repeatedly called for the repealment of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Before Rajapaksa, the previous government acknowledged that the PTA infringes on individual freedoms and promised to repeal the act. Why did they fail to repeal it, and why do you think Rajapaksa's government, the current government, wants to go ahead with it despite the legal criticism that they face?
Well, I mean, this feeds into the last question that you asked me, actually. And the last question you asked me was about extremism and about whether this could be used on other people. And this is the point I made at the end of that discussion with you, which is that once a government has in its ability the power to create its policy on minority groups or its own population, this is something that is going to be really difficult to reverse. And so asking me why a government wants to give up its power to do something is really straightforward. Once you've given it the power, it's just extraordinarily difficult to, and I've not met a government in any country in the world at the moment that would want to give away its power. When you want to refight for your freedom, that's a really difficult fight to have, and you have to fight very hard for it. The only way the Sri Lankan government will repeal any legislation and relinquish aspects of its power is if the population forces it to through lobbying and voting.
Right. We will have to end on that note. Thank you, Tayab Ali, Shakir Nawaz, and Lukman Harees for joining us in the show. Keep watching In Focus South Asia.